In a new op-ed for the Niskanen Center, professor of political science at Rutgers University, Lisa L. Miller, writes that both the left and the right are missing the point on violent crime, and partisans will need to work together if any solutions are to be reached.
According to Miller, quote, "We need a path to safety that relies neither on the crushing dehumanization of an ever-expanding carceral state, nor on utopian visions of society without law enforcement. It must become politically possible to be a progressive who appreciates good policing and a conservative who understands that solutions to violent crime must include more than policing and prisons." Lisa L. Miller joins us now to expand on her piece. Welcome to Rising, Lisa.
Thank you very much for having me.
Lisa, there isn't a more polarizing situation across America than the rise in crime, particularly violent crime. As a native Chicagoan, my city is always in the news. I find it very interesting that you have both addressed the liberal side of things from the Democratic angle and what's happening in certain cities, but also what Republicans need to do as well. And you talk about the dehumanization and the incarceral system. We are the largest incarceral state on the globe. Could you talk about that a little bit more? How do we quell crime, but also understand the focus of not expanding a system that's already readily too large?
Yes, it's a great question, and I think the one of the things I'm trying to do in this piece is to first of all focus people's attention on the fact that the United States is a very violent society relative to other democracies in terms of homicide rates and life-threatening violence generally. And I don't think we appreciate that as much as we should, because it really changes the conversation a bit. At the same time, as you point out, we have this crushing carceral state, and if punishment was going to get us out of the problem of violence, we would have solved this problem a long time ago. So clearly, we need to go beyond this to heal this system we have, which is so dehumanizing, but also figure out other solutions. On the left, I think those solutions tend to be long-term, right? Investment in communities, socioeconomic development, which are all great strategies, but they don't really grapple with the problem in the here and now. And recognizing the serious problem of violence and life-threatening violence in the United States, I think forces us to think more systematically about how to deal with violence right in the here and now. At the same time, simply adding more police and putting more people in prison is not going to solve the problem either.
Yeah, I want to read some quotes from your piece because it's just so excellent. You write, "If the problem on the left is refusing to take violence seriously, the problem on the right is a steadfast refusal to take government seriously. That is the positive role that government can play in reducing violence." And you write, "Instead of the ideological preferences of elites on either side, what if we took a bottom-up approach? Most people want what you call punishment plus social and economic investments to reduce violence, common sense firearms regulation, and more effective policing." And then I just want to read one more quote because this hit me really hard. Quote, "Violence in the United States is not an African American problem. It is an American problem to which Black Americans are disproportionately exposed, much like poverty or economic precarity." Explain that. Unpack that for us. I think it's so important.
Well, I think on the right, there's unfortunately a long history of racializing criminal violence and demonizing particular populations, especially African Americans. And this goes way back to the start of the crime wave in the late 1960s and the use of violent crime as a political bludgeon. But if we understand violence more systematically in the United States, we can see that violence affects Americans across demographic groups. It is true that African Americans suffer from serious violence victimization disproportionately. But even if we just look at populations that we don't think of as always exposed to violence, rates of victimization are also higher in those communities. So the United States has a violence problem, and it crosses race and class and ethnicity and region. And if we don't take that seriously, we're sort of destined to fall back on the same old kinds of responses that don't seem to be really fixing the problem. And to your point about taking government and violence seriously, I think on the right, unfortunately, there's been the Republican Party has really been captured by this kind of anti-statist view that government, this is Ronald Reagan's claim, right? Government's not the solution, it's the problem. But the fact is, there are many, many things that governments do to reduce violence, from gun safety regulations to summer jobs programs, to fixing infrastructure, even things as simple as lighting. Improving lighting, getting rid of abandoned buildings. I mean, there's some very simple things that governments do that really help reduce violence. Obviously, there's also long-term investment, which is very important. But even in the immediate here and now, there are things government can do. And I particularly want to highlight the failure on the right to grapple with the gun problem. The United States has the highest rate of civilian firearms ownership in the world. And yet, what we so often these days hear from the right is we need fewer gun regulations, right? More guns. Americans understand that doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't make any sense to think that more guns are going to reduce the gun problem. On the left, we have too often, I think, from people in positions of power, a kind of studied refusal to really grapple with Americans' fear of violence. Americans are understandably worried and understand on a gut level the levels of random violence that just streak across the landscape periodically. And so sort of gaslighting people about violence, which we saw, unfortunately, in this last election sometimes from some elected officials, is not taking violence seriously and not grappling with the normally high rates of violence, let alone what we saw over the past 2 years, which were extremely high rates of violence.
I think that you're right. And to your point, Americans, by and large, when polled, largely want to see common sense gun reforms. No, that doesn't mean they want guns taken out of everybody's households, but it does mean that they support restrictions on gun access, who can own them, changes to the gun show loophole, particularly how it's advanced levels of domestic violence across the country, as well as suicide rates. But the thing that I'm trying to get a little bit more understanding from you on is your idea about some of the Democrats' plans being more long range. Because again, as somebody who comes from Chicago, one of the interests that I have, and I think that many people who studied this at the University of Chicago and other research institutes, has largely been around the root causes, what we can do to make communities safer, that goes back to preventing young people specifically from choosing this life in general, from being the people who perpetuate violence, whether that is better education systems or stronger economic development. A job prevents people in many cases from going out in the streets and doing things like this, particularly a well-paying job, in addition to addressing our housing crises. There are so many things that play into the rise of gun violence, particularly in communities of color. Has your research or the work that you've done been able to elevate that in addition to looking towards some of the other policy changes? Because I do think that there are more long-range issues that need to be taken care of for what we see in this country as a really long-range problem.
I absolutely agree with you, but I think that the problem is it's not either or, right? It's not either we say it just has to be all long term, or we say we have to do something in the immediate term that might involve the justice system. This is the concept of punishment plus, which is not just, I'm not the only one who talks about that. James Forman talks about that in his book, Locking Up Our Own. And I think that the common ground is, look, yes, absolutely. Long-term investment is really the way to tackle violence, and the way that a lot of other countries have done it, right? Giving people a real stake and opportunity in education, in safety in their neighborhoods, in all of the kind of amenities that we think of, that we all want, right? And there's no question that the reason that so many African Americans are suffering more is because of the divestment of that, right? The refusal to invest in, and of course, the long history of racial ethnic bias. But those solutions don't help people right now. I live in Philadelphia. I'm a native Philadelphian. I live here now again. And, how do you say to somebody whose child was just killed, tell you what, we're going to deal with that. It might take a couple decades, or it might take 5 years for these programs to work. And I think that's where the left has to really think seriously about what are the immediate solutions, right? What are the things we can do here and now? We actually know quite a bit about effective law enforcement, effective strategies. Chester, here in Pennsylvania, Chester just had some pretty amazing results from having the district attorney, the mayor, the police commissioner, and community groups work together in something that's called focused deterrence, which is not new. We've known about it for a long time. And it really tries to confront the very tiny number of people that are pushing the violence and giving them alternatives, right? Here are the things you can choose instead. But if you don't, we're going to have to remove you from the community. And I think those kinds of programs that really utilize the best of what we know can happen when law enforcement and cities cooperate, I think have to be on the table, or something else. But what is the here and now that progressive people who care about building up communities can do to grapple with the violence that's happening today, tomorrow, and so on.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have more Rising after this.